Sad, neću puno odugovlačiti, zato što njegov video je već napravio toliko, zato ja žurim, zato što je energija već jako gore, jako pametan i jako duhovit lik. Pričat ćemo ovako, The Great Inflection, Expanding the Value of World Economics Crossroads. Ima bestsellere na Financial Timesu, The Economistu, dakle, stvarno cool, pametan lik i zanima me što će ove godine reći nakon 10 godina na pozornicu Hrvatska. Da vas čujem za našeg Irca David McWilliams. Sir, the stage is yours.
Oh, Jesus. Oh, my God. Thank you so much, Ivan. My God, I forgot all about the Tommies. And you know, the amazing thing about Dalmatians is there's something bizarre in the DNA that they pass down very rapidly to their kids. So that particular, I describe them, by the way, good morning, lovely to be here, all that malarkey, right? I describe that particular group of workers as a Politburo of Galebs. I had never understood the expression Galeb until I realized that every single man in the island of Zlaren spends 96% of his waking hours smoking, drinking coffee, and checking out other people's wives, which, at least in Ireland, we have the decency to disguise. But down there, not at all. So as you know, I am kind of in love with Dalmatia. The family went there about 20 years ago, bought a house, mad idea, got to know the locals, and really never left. But there's one thing we've learned in that 20-year period, and particularly that 10-year interval since I was here, which is my children have grown up in Zlaren. And they have had a number of summer affairs with locals. Hervoyes, aunties, other aunties. There's many aunties. And my son, the same. Lara, Vanya, Katja, lots of Annas. But we have a little test in our family, which is called DMS. So particularly when my son brings one of the local girls up to the house to have a beer or something, and they're, you know, beautiful, they're in their late teens, early 20s, they look fantastic, they speak English really fluently, they're unbelievably cosmopolitan, they've traveled, lots of them have friends in Ireland. In fact, I was always amazed that this is the only country that had a song in the charts about Ryanair, which amazes me, the amount of... it's funny, if you walk into a Dublin restaurant these days, everything is quiet except for the kitchen, and all you hear in the kitchen is "Ay, pichko mater." Full of Croats. Anyway, but the DMS is, so the little Maria will come in and she'll be chatting away to myself and my wife, and then my son will come in and kind of say, like a lot of sons, well, you know, what do you think of Maria? Lovely, lovely. But does she have DMS, which is Dalmatian Mother Syndrome? We have noticed this, that these beautiful Dalmatian teenagers turn into these crazy Dalmatian mothers. Our neighbor beside us is called Male Tome. He's 63. And his mother cooks everything for him. Okay? No evidence of any job, any girls, any career, nothing. So you can probably, after this gig, explain to me, is there a kind of a facial tic for Dalmatian Mother Syndrome that we can use as a leading indicator to warn our son that the beautiful Katerina will turn into the crazy Katerina in about 5 years' time, okay? And once a kid arrives, it's all over, right? So these are the sort of amazingly incisive economic thoughts you're going to be exposed to this evening, or this morning. I will talk about the economy, but just to say, I have kind of fallen in love with Dalmatia, and what I love, I absolutely value, I treasure, I worship, is their endemic laziness. It really fucking amazes me. Without even a flinch, not a jot. The island of Zlaren has about 100 able-bodied young fellas in the island, and they can't find one conabar. You know? Anyway, enough of that. Let us talk about the world. And what a world we have! Jesus Christ, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, I was walking down here, and I passed by the former building, it's just beside us, of the Croatian Communist Party. So I think it's very apt that we start with a quote from Lenin, Vladimir Lenin, because he was talking about world affairs. And Lenin said, there are decades when nothing happens, and there are weeks when decades happen. And in the last 6 or 8 months, you have the impression that we are living through those weeks, where changes are happening in those weeks that in the past we would have had to wait years to even digest. And now they're coming hard and fast. I mean, look at this week. I mean, this week's been particularly of a gem. I mean, who would ever pick a fight with a Canadian? I mean, they are clearly the nicest people in the world. I know I was a dishwasher in Canada as a kid. They are so sweet. I remember having a friend of mine from Bosnia, and I asked her, I said, Amro, what are you thinking about? And she said to me, this is a long time ago, she says, I'm thinking that I'd really like, just for one day, to be a Canadian, where life is calm, everything's predictable, you're really nice to your neighbors, and then you get the great orange-faced Donald Trump, who has decided that you are the enemy. You got that, you've got Panama, and of course last night we got the Gaza as a real estate opportunity. Okay? You know, anyway, these things are coming hard and fast. Last week, I was told that all the investment in AI was necessary. In Ireland, we are building data centers coming out of various orifices, and then DeepSeek told us we don't need them, that you don't need $1 billion. You can create particularly good generative AI for 5 million. All over Europe, things are going to the right. We have an election in Germany. God knows what's going to happen there. So our world is so unbelievably fractured, dislocated, unpredictable, that it's really difficult to know where to start to analyze this world, to make sense of this world. Now, if I was, for example, a British economist, God forbid, the nice thing is they're not really good at economics anymore, which is a thing of beauty for us Irish people. Anyway, if I was a British economist, or let's say a German economist, American economist, or a Croatian economist, I would come here and try to analyze this world armed with the tools of my trade. You know, graphs and charts and mathematics, you know, the toolkit of the economists. But I'm an Irish economist, so I come here this morning only armed with a couple of words of poetry. I want to read, or maybe recite, the words of one of the most famous poems in the English language, which is called The Second Coming by W.B. Yeats. He won the Nobel Prize, Irish writer, probably for a series of poems in which this was one of the standout poems. And he's writing this poem 102 years ago, so about a century ago. And he's sitting in Dublin and he's trying to make sense of the world. The First World War has just happened. The Austrian embassy has disappeared. Why? Because the Austrian Empire has disappeared. So think about how enormous that was. Think about for this part of the world, right? The end of the First World War, the beginning of the first Yugoslavian state, the disappearance of the Austrian Empire, the disappearance of the Ottoman Empire. Like, think of these things that were happening 100 years ago. The disappearance of the German Empire, the emergence of the Soviet Union. In the United States, they have electricity. They have motor cars. For the very first time, they're getting light. These are phenomenal. They have the radio. These are technological advances that we could only just get our head around. Einstein has just won the Nobel Prize. So we're at the beginning of the nuclear age. Now, all this is happening. And Yeats, the Irish poet, tries to make sense of this. And what is important to understand is, even though we feel we are living through these moments of existential crisis, every generation lives through them. Our great-grandparents, our grandparents lived through these, and it's really the way you react to the crisis that is the defining characteristic of the generation. But just listen to these words, written 100 years ago, and imagine they were written now. You can Google it if you want. Turning and turning. So, The Second Coming by W.B. Yeats. Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed on the world, a blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the procession of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, the worst are full of passionate intensity. Now, imagine those words. What Yeats is saying is, the world is turning and turning around in this maelstrom. The falcon, the dangerous creature, has broken free of the falconer. Things fall apart. The center, the essential gravity of our society, the center sometimes does not hold. There is anarchy on the streets. There is blood on the streets. But he said this only happens if the best lack all conviction. And what he means by that is, if the best people in society say, it's not my problem, allowing the worst with their passionate intensity to win the day. Their passionate intensity then, as now, is their slogans, their easy solutions, etc. So what has always fascinated me was not just the rhythm of history in economic, political, and social cycles, but something maybe even more interesting for an economist, which is the following. If you contrast what the poet Yeats was saying 100 years ago with what my tribe, the economists, the people who were paid to think and predict the future were saying, something fascinating emerges. The poet says things will fall apart, the center will not hold. If you go back and look at what was the economists, the government advisors, the military people, the civil servants, all of them were saying after the First World War, it is the war to end all wars. We're going to go back to the gold standard. Oh, don't worry, everything's going to be fine. The Germans, they'll pay those reparations. Don't be worried. Nothing will happen in Germany. It'll be fine. But amazingly, the poet was saying, no, it won't be fine. Within a year of Yeats writing those words, Mussolini was in power in Italy. Hitler had had his coup, or his putsch, in Germany, in Munich, and Stalin was in the ascendancy in the Soviet Union. So the poet was right, and the economists at this tipping point were all wrong. So the question is, why is it when the world is in a state of chassis, in a state of crisis, that the poet, the artist, the musician, these types of people get things right, and the economists, the statisticians, get things wrong? Now, I think it is because the poet, the musician, the artist, the writer, the fictional writer, these types of people with these types of brains give themselves the permission to think unconventionally at a crisis point. Whereas my tribe, the economists, go back to convention. So at a tipping point, artists, poets, musicians give themselves the permission to think unconventionally. Which leads me to the idea that right now we need those people in our society much more than we see them. We need to reward these types of brains. Now the question is, do we reward unconventional thinking? Now we kind of say we do because, you know, it's much easier, it's much nicer to say, oh, fuck man, I'm unconventional. Jesus, yeah, absolutely. But do we actually reward these types of people? And maybe the best place to answer that question is to go to the place that we learn to think originally, to go back to school. So what I'd like you to do is, if you can bear it, go back to when you were 13 or 14 or maybe 12, when you were in school. Just, I can remember exactly the person I was. I can remember what I looked like. I can remember the people who sat beside me. I can remember the teachers. I can also remember the smell of our classroom. The whole of Ireland in the early 1980s smelt of damp sheep, right? This is before Gore-Tex, so Ireland is a very wet place. And if you don't have Gore-Tex and you wear wool, you smell like a sheep. So our entire class smelled like a sheep. Can you remember who you were when you were 13? Can you remember all the people you sat beside in school? Can you remember all the mad little creatures who sat beside you or in your class in school? Can you remember all the wonderful little brains that were in that class, firing up with all sorts of mad ideas? These brains, we know as we get older, like, so for example, when I was in school, I sat beside about 5 fellas who spent 5 years in secondary school looking at the window, just didn't get it, hadn't rashers what was going on, right? But they've gone on to have very successful lives in their own way. But the problem in school is their brains that didn't accept answers were not only not respected, they were degraded, they were humiliated, they were told, you'll never get anywhere. So in school, we reward one type of intelligence. That's the little kid that can go into a class, can absorb huge amounts of data and ideas inside his or her head, and when it comes to exam time, just write like fuck in a coherent, logical fashion. That's the type of brain and the type of intelligence we reward. It's like getting a prize for being a walking filing cabinet. And all the other little kids are undermined because their brains don't work that way. But as we get older, we realize there are thousands of different types of intelligence. And there are thousands of right answers to even the same questions. But we don't reward that in school. And as a result of that, there are thousands and thousands of incredibly clever people walking around here in Zagreb who left school feeling very stupid. The corollary is also the case. There are many actually quite stupid people walking around Zagreb who feel very clever because their brains were rewarded. They kept doing well in exams. They kept getting the mythical pet that I hear so much about from deranged Dalmatian mothers about their brilliant children. I've just realized that there's one thing that Irish mothers and Dalmatian mothers have in common. In fact, Irish mothers are the sort of mothers that make Dalmatian mothers look unambitious. So if you look at those kids, they leave school with their 5. They go to university. I teach in university. I get them all into university. They leave university, they do very well. They go on and they join the big companies, the management training courses for clever kids. They join the big institutions. They go into Silicon Valley. They go into all sorts of establishment places. And then something very bizarre happens in the interview process to get into these places, is that they tend to be interviewed by people who are just older versions of themselves. So the interview process, you go in and say, oh, you're very clever. Oh, no, my God, you went to that school. Oh, brilliant, brilliant. You went to that university. Oh, that's fantastic. Then you went to Harvard. Oh, fuck, you're a genius. Just have the job, right? So what happens is the interview process in our institutions almost becomes like Tinder for people who can do algebra, right? And what does that lead to in companies, in teams, in societies? It leads to something bizarre called groupthink, where everybody in the corporation comes from the same intellectual gene pool. We humans like to think we surround ourselves with people who think differently to us, but we don't. There's a thing called confirmation bias in psychology. We surround ourselves with people who confirm our biases, who think the same way. And what happens in the way our education system and our reward system and our value system in Europe is set up is that our companies and our institutions end up being run by people from a very, very small intellectual, social, political, economic, and personal gene pool. And that leads to groupthink. And why groupthink is very, very dangerous at tipping points is because if you are the sort of person who has always been right, who got all the great results all the way up in school, in university, your entire status as a person is wrapped up in being the person who gets things right. And the problem for that is it's very, very difficult to be wrong. But we know that you only learn when you're wrong, because when you're right, you know the stuff. So you're only learning when you're wrong. And this leads us to make massive mistakes at tipping points. And this, for a society faced with, or a company, or even a team, faced with a myriad of dilemmas that are going on, is incredibly dangerous, this conventional thinking. Galbraith, the great Canadian economist, he's Canadian. The Americans pretend he's American because he's very good, but he's actually Canadian. He said something about conventional people. He said, when faced with the choice between changing his mind and finding the proof not to do so, the conventional man always gets busy looking for the proof, because changing his mind is an affliction to him. So this is exactly the dilemma we need to wriggle out of at a tipping point when the world is so fractious, so disruptive, so ever-changing, so unpredictable, so uncertain as it is at the moment. And then you've got to think, well, what about the economy? What is the economy itself? So we've got this way of thinking. Then what about the economy? The economy, when you break it down, is nothing more than the aggregation of millions of little decisions that are taken every day by us. So even today, everyone, you have made dozens of economic decisions, dozens. You're not even aware of them. Over a week, you will make thousands of economic decisions. And then when you aggregate all those up, so should I buy, should I sell, should I go out, should I get the bus, should I go to the cinema, should I not, should I log on, should I go online, should I buy, should I go on Amazon? All these things are economic decisions. When you aggregate all these billions of decisions up worldwide, that is the economy. That's all it is. So to understand the economy, you've got to understand this weird yoke, this creature that is making those decisions, the human being. And this sometimes bizarrely challenges economics. Why? Because economists say things like, well, I teach them when they come into university, I say, well, what's the first thing you learn in economics? They say, well, professor, we learned that man is rational. That's the basis of economics. Man is rational. We are cold, we are scientific, we are calculating, we are slightly robotic when it comes to making decisions according to economics. Are we actually like that? Have you ever met a human being like that? Would you go for a drink with somebody like that? No, because they don't exist. In reality, we are profoundly irrational. And we are profoundly gullible and influenced by other people, which is the basis, as we've seen, of advertising. It's the basis of advertising. Why? Because humans not only are not scientific, we have no idea what we want. When you think about it, why do people buy things? People buy things because other people buy things. Because we've seen it somewhere, because we're influenced, because we talk to each other, because we gossip with each other. In fact, gossiping is one of the least well understood part of economics. Because we can speak, because we can communicate, because we can tell stories, because we can create images, because we operate in tribes, humans are unbelievably susceptible to feeling very excited about things and also very depressed about things. And the economic cycle is nothing more than, for example, people getting excited together. I notice it down again in Dalmatia when people are buying second houses, particularly people from Northern Europe, and they spot us in the island and we look like aliens in comparison to everybody else. And usually they're Germans, so they're a little bit reticent to tell you what they're actually doing there. They're quite secretive people, Germans, which is quite nice because they're actually quite dull, so you don't really want to get to know them very well. And they'd say to us like, yeah, so you bought a house here. What did the locals like? I said, they're horrible. They're awful, they'll kill you all, right? But they say, yeah, you bought it. And then you can see all these Germans, they come off a yacht and they get a bit drunk and they start getting into the house buying idea, right? And it's like an infectious virus, you know, okay? And suddenly, yeah, you paid so much for that house of these little people. That's amazing, you know? And you can see them getting giddy together. And what happens is the Germans will come in, and the Brits are the worst for it, and they all get giddy. Oh my God, I have to buy a house in an island in Dalmatia, I have to buy a house. And they start talking to each other, and they get giddy, and the price of the house keeps going up, and the house goes up and up and up and up, and they're giddy, and then they end up paying Tomé, the GDP of a small African nation, for a shitty house on Brach, okay? And then suddenly say, oh my God, you spent fucking 800,000 euros on that, and they're all up here, and they're all excited, and then somebody goes, oh my God, shit. Then the prices start to fall, and the Germans start to panic, and the Germans start to try to sell things, and they try to sell things, but they can't find any. The prices keep falling, and basically what you have in the economy is people get excited together, and they gossip, and they get overconfident, and they get depressed together. And that is the business cycle. The business cycle that we hear so much in economics about is nothing more than understanding the way in which humans behave collectively together. And the question for every business in Croatia or in Europe or wherever is to figure out, are we at this part of the cycle where we're down here, slightly energized by what's going on, or are we up here where prices are far too high? So, for example, in our Magnificent Seven companies in the United States, does it make any sense that 30% of the S&P is made up of 7 companies in an index of 500? That means there's 493 other companies not doing anything. Think about it. Does that make sense, or is that indicative of the fact that we're up here in the cycle? I think we are very close to a massive bubble in these things, which will change profoundly the way in which the tech industry operates. So the other thing, you've got to think in a certain way, try to be and listen to unconventional speakers and thinkers, but then you've got to figure out, okay, where are we in this massive, massive economic cycle. Are we down here? Are we up here? Are the valuations good value? Are they overstretched? Are we excited? Or are we about to get collectively depressed? And then finally, let's talk about the last thing, which is economic supercycles, because that's the way the world actually works. It doesn't work in 1 year. The world works in decade-long cycles, and I happen to believe that we are at the end of one massive supercycle, which is why we're so confused, and we're about to go into another supercycle, which can take decades, 3 decades, 4 decades. And just briefly, I think this supercycle that we're at the end of began in and around the fall of the Berlin Wall. So the late 1980s, you have a profound structural change in the global way of thinking about the world. I don't need to tell people in this audience what that experience was like. You have the end of one notion, this Cold War notion. You have the beginning of what we call Pax Americana, where the Americans come in, they dominate the global institutions of the World Health Organization, tariffs and trades, etc., etc. They reduce profoundly the notion of big government. The Americans open up globalization, so you have the free movement of people, the free movement of goods, the free movement of capital. You have this mass movement, which is why all we can hear from Irish kitchens is Ideo Pitchku Mater. These are very significant ideas. You have the movement of American capital out of America into Europe. My country did extremely well from this period of 40 years. We went from being very, very poor to being quite well off. Croatia emerged as an independent country. Central Europe emerged. But it was based on the idea that the Americans were going to sort things out. Small government means lower inflation, means lower interest rates. It's a period of very, very low interest rates. It's a period where asset values rise relative to wages, which is why Germans are buying second houses in Dalmatia. It's exactly this whole thing. That 40 years, 2 seconds, Ivan, we're nearly there. Relax. Okay, Ide. Okay, I'll be back in a second. Right? Don't be fucking walking around in the eye line, okay? Marsh! Okay, I'll be 2 minutes. That long, you have to treat them like that, by the way. I used to be a TV presenter as well, okay? Slap them down. Right. That supercycle, which we have all lived our adult lives through, that large supercycle of globalization, of low interest rates, of the European Union expanding, of capital going where it wanted to go, of people in Europe being able to travel around, of us being able in Ireland to make essentially American stuff for Americans and get away with it, that's over. And that's why the world feels so weird. It's because we are going from one massive supercycle to another. And the new supercycle, the old supercycle, was internationalism, cosmopolitanism, the rule of international institutions, etc. This new cycle is nationalism. It's protectionism. It's moving towards bigger government, not smaller government. Europeans all across Europe are saying to the government, please protect us. It's going to lead to higher inflation. It's going to lead to higher interest rates. It's going to lead to less people traveling. It's going to lead to less capital moving. It is moving into something that smells and feels like something our parents would understand. Whereas we were brought up in a world that was entirely new. And as I said, some countries benefited from this, Ireland being the standout example. Other countries found it very difficult, this transition. But the point is now it's over. Look at what's happening in Europe. Every single successful politician is saying no to immigration, no to the free movement of capital, yes to higher social welfare, yes to controls on companies moving in and out, and ultimately controls on population. This is new for us. So just end, take those in. We've got a way of thinking. We've got to figure out where we are in the national business cycle. Then we've got to figure out where we are in this massive economic new super cycle. And then just finally, just listen one more time to the words of the poet, the second coming. Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the centre cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed, a blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the procession of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, the worst are full of passionate intensity. What the poet is saying is if the worst people in society are allowed to run the game, very bad things will happen. But if the best people in society stand up, then the society can balance itself and deal with these issues. Now, when I look out here this morning, and I look at the people, and I asked Aaron, the people in the room, you are the best in Croatia. You are the people who understand the technology. You are the people with a certain amount of financial, commercial, and consequently social status. You are the people that when the poet looks for the best at a time of a tipping point, he's asking all of you to stand up and not allow your own backyard to unravel. So just if you want to get a sense of the future a little bit more clearly, my only advice to you today, which is do not buy a place on the coast in Dalmatia if you want to remain solvent. That's number one. Number two, warn your sons about Dalmatian mother syndrome, because it's clearly something in the genes. But maybe more importantly, if you want to understand the future a little bit more clearly, my only advice to you is listen a little bit less to my tribe, the economists, and listen a little bit more to Yeats's tribe, the poets. And that's how you will see the world clearly and transparently at a tipping point. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. David. Thank you. No, don't run away now. You've been 10 minutes over time. I want to ask you one question. A question I have for you. First, did the marble table get built after 20 years?
It got built by
Tomo.
Absolutely not.
No,
what you need to find in Dalmatian is a nosy and enterprising Austrian. Okay? They are a particularly complex bunch, but you give an Austrian a challenge and an angle grinder, and he is in heaven.
Yes, we had a guy also.
You know those guys. So what I would say is find the enthusiastic Austrian, drink with Tome, and say
enthusiastični Austrians.
Yes.
Really fucked up Europe one time, you know?
They did. That's
be careful with enthusiastic Austrians.
Well,
they can be really enthusiastic.
Well,
we had experience in Croatia with them.
You had experience, but we take a physical rain check on the Austrians. So if they're quite short and have a rather unprepossessing,
yes,
and funny hair, we say, you know what, no. But seriously, you find an enthusiastic Austrian with limited political ambitions.
Yes. I also have to say that you're funny, a bit pessimistic, and a bit rude. You fit in Dalmatia very, very well. So thank you, Mr. David.
Cheers, Ivan.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you.